And how did Egypt differ from other Arabic-speaking lands? After all, in Egypt in this period, we speak of Egyptian nationalism, something we do not speak of in countries like Syria or Iraq. So how did Egypt differ? Egypt differed from other Arab-speaking lands in the sense that Egypt was a very separate, independent case unto itself. Egyptian nationalism emerged against a very specific reality that existed only in Egypt and not in other Arab countries, and that is the British occupation. There was therefore a specific Egyptian, rather than Arab, Muslim, or Ottoman content to the nationalist movement that emerged in Egypt. It had a specific geographical and political definition. During the 19th century, as we have already seen, Egypt underwent a series of radical changes. The foundations of the modern state of Egypt built by Muhammad Ali. Egypt underwent an economic revolution of sorts, basing the economy on an export-oriented agriculture, particularly the growing of cotton for export and the sugar industry. There was considerable social change in Egypt in the 19th century. The new school system, the printing press, journalism and legal reform, all of that was very similar to other parts of the Ottoman Empire. And like in other parts of the empire, the introduction to the world of ideas and the lifestyle of Europe. Egypt in the 1870s was Egypt in a situation of bankruptcy and ever-increasing international intervention in Egypt's finances to ensure payment of the huge debt that the Egyptians had accumulated in the very rapid project of modernization instituted very much under the rule of Khedive Ismail. In 1879, Khedive Ismail was removed by the European powers in favor of his son, Tawfiq. Egyptian Arabic-speaking officers of the Egyptian army began to express ever-increasing disapproval of this international influence in Egyptian politics. And this disapproval of the Arabic-speaking officers was also representative of more profound trends of social disaffection inside Egypt at that time. There was increasing tension between the Arabic-speaking Egyptians and the older upper class of Turco-Circassian officers and the land-owning elite, also of Turco-Circassian background in many places, who had become predominant since Muhammad Ali's assumption of power. This Turco-Circassian elite, in part Turkish, that is, Turkish administrators and officers who had remained in Egypt and become very prominent, or Circassians who had served with the Mamluks and whose origins were in the Caucasus and had become part of this new ruling elite in Egypt. And they, together with Arab Egyptian landowners, were equally interested in the restriction of foreign influence, which naturally eroded their stature too. These are the early beginnings of a very clear-cut, openly expressed Egyptian identity. Educated Egyptians were also influenced by new archaeological discoveries of the Egyptians' glorious ancient past. There was the creation of a sense of continuity between Egypt's great pre-Islamic past and its Islamic history. This had great impact on collective identity. If one ventures to study Egypt's pre-Islamic past, one is touching upon a core issue in the Islamic interpretation of history. The pre-Islamic past in the Islamic interpretation of history is known as the Jahiliyyah. Jahiliyyah, the period of ignorance. There was nothing positive to say about the pre-Islamic past of Egypt. It was this period of ignorance and barbarism that was succeeded by the great civilization of Islam. But if one is beginning to value, because of the great findings of pharaonic Egypt, that the pre-Islamic past of Egypt was something to be proud of and something to be seen in a very positive light, one is beginning to question the Islamic interpretation of history. And if one is to value Egypt's pre-Islamic past, one is eroding the centrality of Islam in the Egyptian collective identity. Rifat Tahtawi, who lived from 1801 to 1873 and was one of the leading students in the Muhammad Ali era who studied in Paris from 1826 to 1831. Under the impact of European ideas, Tahtawi spoke frequently of nations and countries and made it clear that a nation was bound to a specific territory. Egypt was one such country, and the Egyptians were a nation, says Tahtawi, who should love their fatherland like the Europeans love theirs. Tahtawi's writings about Egypt's uniqueness were published in a book on the historic and geographical distinctiveness of Egypt in 1869. Khedive Ismail built a national library and a museum, and the introduction of pre-Islamic history into Egypt's schools was becoming an important facet of the evolution of a particular Egyptian identity. Writers like Yaqub Sanua and Abdallah Nadim popularized the terms of Egyptianness and the Egyptians in the 1870s and the 1880s, and sounded the slogan of Egypt for the Egyptians. And it was against this background that there was ever-increasing opposition in Egypt to increasing foreign influence. And this opposition to increasing foreign influence was expressed in the early 1880s in the Urabi Rebellion, the rebellion led by an Arab-speaking Egyptian officer by the name of Ahmed Urabi, who rose against this increasing foreign dominance in Egyptians' internal affairs. There were various reasons for the disaffection of Ahmed Urabi and his fellow Arabic-speaking Egyptian officers. Their promotion to the highest ranks in the military were blocked by the Turco-Circassian elite. Many lost their jobs in the financial crisis of the 1870s. And in 1881 and 1882, there were repeated uprisings of the officers under Ahmed Urabi against the economic situation, against the Turco-Circassian domination, and against increasing foreign intervention in Egypt's domestic financial affairs. Urabi spoke for the most part in traditional Islamic terms, but he also used the slogans of Abdallah Nadim on Egypt for the Egyptians. From May 1882, Egypt became increasingly rebellious and disorderly. Riots broke out in Alexandria in June, and the European quarter of the city was sacked by the rioters. In July of 1882, the British Navy shelled Alexandria. And in September of that year, the British occupied Egypt. This was to be a temporary occupation, the British said. But in the end, it lasted for no less than 70 years. Ahmed Urabi was exiled to Ceylon, today's Sri Lanka.